Today's conversation was recorded live in London at the Pistoia Alliance meeting 2026, which feels like exactly the right setting for a discussion about where life sciences technology is really. Because underneath all the talk about AI, data, automation, and platform, there is a very human question. Can we make drug development learn faster than it forgets? My guest is Patrick Ansems, who is now globally responsible for life sciences strategy at Siemens, across pharma and medical devices. His path into this world was not a straight line. He started with a background in cell biology and biochemistry, worked at the Unilever Health Institute, moved into a startup working on protein-protein interactions in chronic heart failure, and then found his way into lab bioinformatics. Through a story that includes selecting a platform, getting fired, and then being hired within 24 hours by the very company behind that platform. Since then, Patrick has worked across companies, including PerkinElmer Informatics, Tetrascience, Dotmatics, and now Siemens. So he has seen the industry from multiple angles: small and large companies, science and software, R&D, and manufacturing, strategy, and execution. In this episode, we'll talk about why AI is forcing leaders to think differently, why fair data suddenly has new urgency, why pharma still depends so much on Excel, PowerPoint, and institutional memory, and what it will take to connect discovery, development, and manufacturing into something closer to a learning system. We also get into the messy middle of tech transfer, the importance of context, and the idea of pharma in the loop, from molecule to market. Patrick, welcome to Tech and Drugs.
Yeah, hi, Patrick. Welcome to the show. So we are recording live today from the Pistoia Alliance meeting in London. It's the day 2 of the event. So what is it that stood out for you so far?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Thibaut, for having me today. I think the presentation from Tim Lappy really stood out, right? He was talking about like how cancer is not fair. And he was talking about a very kind of personal situation in his life that really affected himself and as well as his family. And what resonates quite a lot with me on that front is that the reason why we're actually all working in this industry is it's to help fundamentally patients and their families, right? To kind of get themselves cured from all of these diseases that they're suffering with. So connecting that to the person, and to the patients, I think that's why we're all here, and that's why the Pistoia is here. So I really kind of resonate with that overall story.
Yeah. No, you're right. You know, I often start my presentation, whenever I do a presentation, where start with a patient, and next to a patient, it's written there are 20 or 24,000 known diseases.
Yeah.
14,000 are rare disease. We have 3,000 drugs. Those 3,000 drugs are not against 3,000 diseases because we have multiple drugs for the same diseases. So we have maybe 1,000 drugs. So the gap between what patients need and what we have is enormous.
Yeah.
And in a good year, we have 50 drugs that are approved by the FDA. So at this pace, we need 500 years to cure all diseases.
Yeah.
And that's, when I have discussion with people who are like AI skeptics, which is okay. I mean, it's good we are scientists to be skeptical. I always tell them, like, if we continue to do things the way we do, I mean, we are not really helping our patient. And so far, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, AI is our best shot.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the entire disease space, right, every cell fundamentally makes about 20,000 proteins. We have identified that the kind of chemical and biological space is 10 to the order of 60. And
yeah.
So if you kind of combine these things, it is impossible to kind of make a certain things. I was listening to another podcast where they were kind of saying that one out of every 20 medicinal chemists actually finds a molecule that has been brought to market. So, I mean, that is quite daunting, right? If you look at the chemical space, if you look at the targets that we have, it is almost impossible to do that with like humans and just experimentations as we have been doing it before. And then to add to that is the entire cost mechanism behind it, right? I mean, if you look at how much it costs to bring a molecule to market, it's currently more than 10 years and around 2.6 billion. So multiply that with the amount of diseases that you have, you're coming up with astronomical numbers that I can't even kind of imagine.
Yeah. You've joined the Pistoia Alliance. How long have you been part of the Pistoia Alliance, and what is motivating you for coming to the Pistoia Alliance meetings?
Well, I think what is motivating in the Pistoia Alliance is kind of the non-competitive nature of that, right? It's kind of not about a vendor or it's not about a pharma company, but it's it's kind of coming together as a humanity and kind of trying to solve some of these very complicated tasks that we have at hand. And I think that resonates the most with me with the kind of overall Pistoia Alliance concept. I've been monitoring and part of the Pistoia for many years. I mean, I've been part of this industry for about 15 years or so, and Pistoia has always been a common thread between all of these journeys that I've been going through. And I think, as I said, that's really kind of important why we have these type of non-competitive consortia just to discuss all of these things.
Yeah, no, it's true. I joined Pistoia Alliance like many jobs ago, and I keep coming back. And I remember when LLM started, not so long ago, but in AI timeline, it feels like prehistorical ages. I remember sitting in online meetings with members of the community that were sharing how they were using their first LLM experiments on their internal data. And there were companies that were actually competing, but they were competing in the drug market, not in how they use LLM. So they were explaining, we tried this, it didn't work, we tried that, it didn't work. So for those who are starting just now, go directly to step 4. I mean, don't do all the mistakes we've done. And I thought that was incredible. That's the thing that keeps, make me coming back to this community.
Yeah, and really the pace in which this kind of agentic AI is evolving is phenomenal, right? I mean, as long as I'm part of the Pistoia, we kind of talked about fair data, right? Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But we've always kind of been hovering at a certain stable front. Now with the kind of addition of AI into those conversations, it starts to kind of rapidly increase. Budgets become available at these organizations because it's all AI. Problems are fundamentally still the same, but now we actually have something that we are working towards to be utilizing that to actually start doing drug development in a much better and faster pace.
So if we step back a little bit, because whenever I have someone on the show, I like to know a bit more about them. Sure. So what is it that brought you to what you do today? So did you like science as a kid? What was the trigger for actually working in this industry and working in a job where I'm pretty sure that when you went to university, like the training for what you do today didn't exist?
Yeah, I mean, if we go all the way back to what I wanted to become, my like when I was in my early teens, I kind of wanted to become a GP.
Oh, me too.
It was relatively quick that we figured out that I wasn't smart enough to actually become a GP.
Me too.
So I then kind of pivoted to the things that was closest to that. And I actually I've went to let's say school to collect a bachelor's degree in cell biology and biochemistry. Yeah. I was actually not even smart enough to go to university and actually do a PhD. But what I didn't do in, let's say, theoretical classes, I kind of made up in experience. So right after my studies, I worked for a couple of years for the Unilever Health Institute in Vlaardingen in the Netherlands, kind of developing new, let's say, products like B-cell proactive, that is a butter that lowering, let's say, blood cholesterol. I also worked for brands like Slim Fast and, let's say, green tea brands to kind of help with the increase of epicatechins in tea to kind of improve satiety feelings. But after that, I kind of went to a startup company where I've done protein-protein interaction. And that's also how I got into my life as a kind of a lab informatics specialist. So at that point in time, we were, let's say, about 20 people company, and we developed, let's say, some drugs that were beneficial to protein-protein interaction in relationship to chronic heart failure. And then we wanted to sell these molecules to a large pharma organization. And as part of that journey, I was identified as the person to kind of set up the lab infrastructure. So I kind of, like you always do, right, kind of explore the fields, look at all of the vendors that are currently out there, and selected a platform. But what we didn't do that well at that point in time is that we selected a platform, but we didn't have any idea what we wanted to do actually with it. So long story short, that actually got me fired. And interestingly enough, within 24 hours, I actually got hired by the company that actually acquired their platform, but we didn't actually implement in the end. So that's how I rolled into becoming a field application scientist for biology at that time at PerkinElmer Informatics. That has now become Revity. And I kind of progressed that career throughout. So I've worked a couple of years at Tetrascience. I've run the pre-sales organization at Dotmatics. And as of end of last year, I'm now globally responsible for the strategy of Siemens within the kind of life sciences space, which is Pharma and Devices.
So you went from startup to one of the largest companies in the world.
Yes, so it's an interesting journey. I kind of gone large, small, and then large again.
Yeah. So one topic we'll talk about technical nerdy thing soon.
Mm-hmm.
But one topic I'm getting more and more interested actually lately is the topic of leadership in the era of AI, because I think it's really changing how you're managing your organization, how you're leading people. There are huge topics around adoption of tools. I was at a meeting with a tech company recently where they were telling us that they are forcing employees to use AI tools, and those who don't use AI tools are actually put on performance improvement plan.
Mm-hmm.
When I discussed that with some folks in pharma, they were like, "Oh no, we can't do that, and we won't do that." And actually, I do understand, but it kind of raised also the question on what actually does it mean to lead a company through such a transformation. And I'd love to get your perspective on that from what you've seen in your company or with some of the life science leaders you've been working with.
Yeah, I think what I find interesting, and one of the things that we've done ourselves as an organization, is you kind of need to enable your senior management around the utilization of AI. Right? It's not only about AI asking actually a question, but it's about utilizing AI as a kind of a conversational partner. Right? It's not necessarily there to kind of just write smarter emails and making nice PowerPoint presentations. It actually gives you an opportunity to kind of have a dialogue with them and give you views and perspectives you might have not thought of yourself. And if you start utilizing AI as that way, as a kind of a thought partner, not necessarily an enable to do things much quicker and faster, that's when it starts to open up a completely new world. So take as an example in my current job, right? I need to write a strategy for Siemens, which is a very large company. They have a lot of very interesting technology, and you need to figure out what your white space is and how you're competing and what you might want to acquire, and utilizing AI to kind of utilize that information and help you kind of come up with alternative strategies is actually quite mind-blowing, and it puts you back into the core of what you need to do, which is think about all of the options that you have on the table. And within pharma and life sciences and medical devices, you kind of see the same thing, right? The organizations that don't adopt AI will be running behind. But the question on how to adopt it and what you actually need to do in order to adopt AI to the fullest extent, I think is the biggest question mark. And linking that back to the Pistoia meeting that we had for the last 2 days, that's kind of a recurring topic, is how do you generate data in such a way that actually Agentic AI or LLMs can actually start utilizing that information. And that conversation has not changed significantly over the last couple of years. And as mentioned, we always talk about fair data principles. Those things are still applicable, but they're now kind of rebranded into like an AI project.
Do you think that there are new skills or mindset that people need to have to be successful in this in this time where there are all those changes?
I think so. What I see a lot with companies that are successful in utilizing AI is kind of either bringing together teams or developing individuals to not only have a scientific background or scientific mindset, but also having a data mindset, right? I mean, for a company where we call them cyborgs, right? The people that have an understanding of both tech as well as science. And there can be people that are coming from tech backgrounds that learn some of the principles of science or the other way around. But you see more and more in organizations that people with those type of profiles or actually looking at developing skills in both of those areas are becoming really impactful and are becoming, let's say, the new leaders of some of these pharma organizations.
Yeah. So one thing that we often hear is that science is moving fast, but decision-making and workflows are still feel quite slow. So why does that gap persist even with AI entering into the picture?
Well, I think what is really interesting in the kind of scientific domain is that things we couldn't accomplish, let's say 10 years ago, all of a sudden are now really mainstream, right? Think about whole genome sequencing, right? Roughly 15 years ago, that wasn't necessarily a thing. And now fundamentally, everybody can get their whole genome sequenced. Cost of those technologies are going down, so they're becoming much, much more mainstream. However, like as all of these scientific technologies advance, the way how we communicate and collaborate is still fundamentally through very fragmented systems. We have solutions that provide capabilities in a really niche scientific domain, or when we start to transfer information between teams or between departments, we're still dependent on Excel, PowerPoint, and Word documents. So that fragmentation is still the source behind these slow decision-making processes.
So we talked about the concept of lab in the loop, or even pharma in the loop if you extend the loop. How do you think this change organization think about connecting discovery, development, manufacturing? So how do we connect those learning loops to to impacting the traditional silos actually of organizations?
Yeah, I mean, look again at the drug development cycle, right? It's R&D. It's all about kind of tech transfer and then kind of manufacturing that on the manufacturing line. And one of the things which is super interesting is that if you kind of look at it holistically, and there's of course a couple of variations there. Like in R&D, you need to deal with a lot of variability, but the need for compliance is much less, right? Because you're not going to put something into an actual physical patient. When you go more downstream into manufacturing, the variability is low, right? Yeah. Because you're just making one product, but the need for compliance is really, really high. And dealing with everything through that entire paradigm is key. Learning from all of these different steps also becomes really important, right? Because when we discover something in R&D, that doesn't necessarily mean that it ends up in a patient, right? About 90% of the drugs still fail somewhere between it being kind of filed for an IND and then doing some clinical studies, and then all of a sudden they figure out that there's some efficacy that is not happening, or certain toxicology, or there is a kind of a feedback loop somewhere in this completely complex engineered human body that actually prevents the effect that we saw in test tubes or in silico. So learning from that entire paradigm, what happens in R&D, can we actually manufacture that? What have we learned from the manufacturing process? And can we actually utilize that information back when we start developing certain molecules? And that is for us the kind of concept behind that pharma in the loop, or as I like to call it, from molecule to market. Yeah. Right? Can we actually identify a molecule, but can we then also end it up in a patient, right, with a relatively high success rate, and therefore reducing the timeline and also substantially reducing the cost?
So you were mentioning tech transfer, and it's often called the messy middle.
Yeah.
But why do you think this step continue to create friction, even in organizations that have heavily invested in digital labs, automation, and all the things that should solve this problem, but it's still a problem?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like tech transfer process, it's still a process that takes roughly between 18 and 30 months. And like we heard Sophie Biles from AstraZeneca present this entire week about, okay, I've spent hours and hours transforming information from my LIMS system into some type of report that I was going to utilize downstream, right? And that is still, let's say, the biggest bottleneck, is that when we kind of move across that entire value chain, we fundamentally kind of repeat all of those steps and repeat the work that has been done. And we still go back to kind of manually transcribing information that is sitting in systems into the documents that we need to file for regulatory reasons. And it's really good that we have those documents, but there is, I think, still kind of an improvement that could be made by utilizing both the kind of capabilities of LLMs to help with the automation of the reporting, but also with the way how we transfer information between the various different teams.
Yeah, because we still transfer a document, but not necessarily the understanding.
Agreed, right? And I think that this is the biggest thing, right? What we see happening is that in the past, we would do all of these digitization projects to fundamentally just capture information from a compliancy perspective, right? But now what we started to actually do is we're trying to kind of flip that model a little bit upside down. I kind of started to think about, well, what's actually the process in which this information was generated? So it's not only about kind of protecting our intellectual property and making sure that we file that information on time. It's actually how do we utilize that information and the context of which that was generated in order to facilitate better decision making. And that's really the transformation that you kind of see with AI. Right? I mean, AI fundamentally needs all of the context in order to drive, let's say, that next iteration of experiments that you might need to do. But therefore, you need to be able to provide that context already at the point where it's being generated and not after.
I remember in a previous job, like in any pharma companies, we also had challenges with capturing institutional knowledge. And we will have our CSO asking us questions on certain assays or certain target. And sometimes we're like, well, we don't really know where to search because we don't really capture that. So we had to go back to the site and actually talk to the scientists that were there for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
But with what's happening now, with a lot of people were let go of organization. So what happens is that as the knowledge is not necessarily, or the institutional knowledge is not captured properly, so what you create is corporate amnesia. And I think that's something really important. How do we fight that, or how do we build a new system that an enterprise that keeps learning and doesn't forget? I think that's the thing that I have in mind now with we were talking about data, so it's about capturing the data, but it's not just the data, it's how you access the data and make sure that you can access the knowledge behind the data.
Yeah, that's it. I think the key word in this aspect is context, right? In which context was this data point generated? And that means that you need to have the information around, okay, what type of procedure did I utilize, right? What was the context in which it was generated? But also which instrument did generate that data, what was the settings of that instrument, how did the data get actually analyzed. And what we typically see is that those kind of fundamentally three value streams of information are still very disconnected from each other. And in the kind of AI-centric world, all of that information does become key in order to identify what you need to do to actually start to utilize that information in a much more better and profound way.
So it's a great segue actually to the next part that I wanted to discuss with you. The role of platform and ecosystem. So before joining Siemens, you were at Dotmatics. I mean, Dotmatics is now part of Siemens, and Dotmatics has played a significant role in the life science ecosystem. So how would you describe its impact in helping organizations manage and leverage scientific data?
Yeah, what I find interesting in my journey at Dotmatics is that we kind of took let's say, a slightly different view of the world. Like if you look at most of these kind of vendors, they're kind of looking at standardized platforms that will allow you to capture information across modalities and across departments. I think what I really kind of liked about the proposition that Dotmatics was doing is the saying, well, rather than having one centralized platform, we actually believe in the power of the applications that are necessary to analyze actually that information of really specific and niche domains. What has always been the challenge is that when you actually collect that information, it again ends up in files and in systems and on file shares. So what we have done is therefore we have built like a scientific intelligence platform that allows to ingest all of that information from those applications and parse and model that out. So that's a slightly different, let's say, philosophy compared to what we see as the general, let's say, norm. But that has been proven to be quite interesting, actually, approach, because when you start taking that approach and you kind of look at the, let's say, the power of these applications individually, you can start to extend that out of the scientific domain. You can also start to incorporate simulation information, right? Because what I see happening is that currently we generate the data in order to fuel the AI models. I think we're going to go to a world where that model is almost in a reverse order, where the data will actually be generated by the AI system. There will still be a lot of parameters that you will need to test, but you will do that in simulation first, and then verify those results in actual wet lab experimentation. So rather than the data feeding the model will start feeding the type of experiments that you will need to do. And therefore, I think the approach that we've taken from a Dotmatics perspective is kind of saying, okay, all of these applications are that central application layer, and you have a data layer sitting underneath. I think will be quite an interesting and valid approach.
So now Dotmatics is part of Siemens, which is an industry giant.
Yep.
So what does it mean for when the acquisition was announced? I was like, oh, that's interesting. And actually, I was visiting Siemens. They have a very interesting lab, and we had a meeting with 20 pharma company in Vienna.
Yep.
And so it was a group of QC experts that came.
Mm-hmm.
I remember we were visiting this lab. It was super modern, like a proper lab of the future with everything connected, everything automated, and everyone was like, "Oh, I want that." But it's the challenge is that you rarely start from scratch, especially those large companies. Very often they have like a legacy infrastructure. But I remember all of them were like, "Oh, how do I?" That's a vision of what I want. That's a vision of a future that appeals to me. So now that Dotmatics is part of this giant, so what does it mean? How does it multiply what you can do?
Yeah, I mean, we were really excited when the announcement came out that we were part of Siemens, because I think this is really kind of one of those synergies where the value of each other's kind of exponentially grow, right? Because Dotmatics is still fundamentally the leading application or the leading vendor in the R&D space, but now we have all of the additional capabilities from Siemens, from manufacturing and automation and sensors and AGVs that we can now utilize to kind of supplement that what we're doing in the R&D space. So to come back to your story around like the lab that you were in Vienna, that lab still exists. And the beauty of that is that we're actually now extending it even further. So rather than just utilizing it mostly on the kind of manufacturing end, we're actually going to strengthen that messaging with all of the work that we're doing on R&D. Because if you think about this holistically, right, think about like the production of an antibody or the generation of that. It starts with the hypothesis of what you're going to make, right, and how you're going to make it. And therefore, you also would like to utilize already some AI capabilities to kind of predict the likeliness of something to be actually manufactured within a laboratory setting. And then you're going to follow that entire development cycle and tech transfer and getting all of the fermenters and the isolation of the information from SVLC systems. And when that all starts to flow naturally into that kind of scientific backbone that we talked about, and you can further extend that with information that you have from a manufacturing facility around what are the type of issues that we come across, right? What type of sensors do we need to utilize? What type of metrics and conditions do we need to have? You start to really build that kind of pharma in a loop concept. And hopefully you can see that, but I am extremely excited about the thing that we can overall provide towards our customers and in the end towards the patients, of course. And I'm really excited to kind of help Siemens kind of finalize it.
Our listener or viewer can see we have to change settings. That's the beauty of recording during a live conference.
As always, you kind of go with the flow as with proper science, right? You learn, you adjust, right? You develop a new hypothesis and you go ahead with it.
We evolve. Like if there is one thing we learned in science, it's evolution. So,
absolutely.
So yeah, actually, it's we were almost going to to the last part of this conversation. So we talked about a number of things, about the leadership in the era of AI, the tech transfer, and the messy middle. The evolution of your company now that it's in an industry giant. So to conclude our conversation, I wanted to ask you, so if you had any advice to give to leaders navigating AI transformation in life science, what would it be?
I think my predominant advice would be accept that this is the new world, right? But also don't necessarily see it as a silver bullet. I talk a lot to organizations that have a very messy infrastructure and they then think that AI all of a sudden will fix all of the problems that they had. And I think that's a little bit of a utopia, right? There's still a lot of hard work, and we've heard that over the last couple of days in the Pistoia meeting as well, is that if you have a messy infrastructure and a messy data system, AI is not going to necessarily resolve that. Yeah, I mean, I wish it would. It would fix a lot for me as well. But yeah, kind of putting the kind of proper framework in place, whether you invest time and money and effort in kind of building a layer in between that allows you to kind of do data cleanup, or whether you work with the scientists locally to kind of explain to them what the value is of entering information into a structured, let's say in a structured application or data flow, is going to be key, right? As mentioned already before, I see this world changing quite significantly. I mean, as said, currently data is influencing the model. I still think that we'll go to a world where the model is going to recommend the experimentation that we'll need to do. And we'll need to verify that with simulation, because I think you can simulate a lot right now, whether it's the airflows in buildings or electricity consumption, or whether it is the fluid dynamics or thermodynamics within a fermenter. there's a lot that can already be done in silico before you actually start to perform experimentation. What will be interesting, at least from my perspective, is that we see now a lot of these kind of AI capabilities and utilization in early R&D, and you kind of see it in manufacturing. But I'm really curious to see how that will evolve when we start to talk about, okay, the human in that concept, right? Because we're still basing a lot of the work that we do on animal models, and having the kind of capabilities to simulate a human. I think that will become quite an interesting, and I would kind of encourage or see or hope that that will actually become the next iteration of what we do as a society.
So you should listen to one of my upcoming episodes where I will be talking actually to an expert, toxicology expert, where we will be talking about animal replacement, and so a few months ago the FDA was announcing what people labeled a bit too quickly the end of animal experimentation. I mean, this will take time, but one thing that we know of, I mean, animal doesn't always translate to human. I mean, it's served us really, really well, but of course there are so many questions around animal experimentation, the ethical question about doing experiments on animals, technical things, scientific question on the translation from animal to human, and also the cost.
Yeah.
So obviously there is a lot of discussion around the new alternative method, and the in silico method are definitely very high on the agenda of can we use that to actually replace animal experimentation, or at least for the foreseeable future augment animal experimentation.
Yeah, I think that for me is currently still one of the things that is the missing link. So I will be looking very much forward to the kind of follow-up of your podcast series to kind of hear what, let's say, some other people will think about that.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to ask also, if there is, one misconception that people in our space have about AI and that you think needs to be challenged.
I think the biggest misconception for me, as I said, is that AI is the silver bullet, right? That will just fix everything. And I think we have really good models in certain areas. Like look at AlphaFold, and also look at like what companies like Isomorphic and Recursion are doing. It's like really early on in the drug development and drug design. AI has already kind of a really good set of applications there. And we're kind of all anticipating what will happen in some of those molecules in some of the clinical trials. So, and also in late stage, there's already quite a number of very good applications with kind of modeling entire factory floors before actually a single slab of concrete has been built. I think what is, for me, still a little bit of a misconception is we'll just go and type in a disease, and then all of a sudden AI will come up with a target and saying, hey, these are the 5 molecules that you should be testing. I think we're still quite a bit away from that. I expect and I anticipate that will come, but I wouldn't be surprised if that still is like 10, 15 years away.
Great segue to my concluding part. It's, I ask you to look into the future. So you mentioned isomorphics, and isomorphics comes from Google DeepMind and Demis Hassabis, who received the Nobel Prize for the development of AlphaFold.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm a structural biologist, so the type of thing that I've done during 5 years during my PhD, now they do it in a few minutes. So for me, that was like a revelation when this was launched. But Demis Hassabis during a TV interview said that by 2030 there will be no diseases anymore, or that we will be able to cure all disease. I think it might be a bit over optimistic, but I'd love to hear your perspective on like the key trends you foresee over the next 5 to 10 years. And I know it's a difficult question because I can't tell you what will happen in the next 6 months in the era of AI. But if you try to think forward, what do you think are the biggest thing that will impact our industry and our world?
I think we'll still continue to leverage AI, but we'll just see much more broader applications to that. I mean, currently a lot of the kind of AI models that we have are really good at doing one thing specifically, right? Think about protein folding or predicting binding, right? I think we'll come to, let's say, the world where we start utilizing agentic AI and do all of these things in sequence. But in order to do that, we still need to have certain models, right? We kind of talked about the animal models and the lack of, like, say, human systems biology within AI. And of course, there's now kind of the organ on a chip that's kind of evolving as well, right? Where we're kind of saying, okay, we're going to replace that, we're going to utilize that in order to replace some of the animal testing. So I think we will continue to progress. I hope and I foresee a world where at some point in time it does become as simple as saying, I have a disease, give me a number of targets, and these are the potential molecules. I'm hoping that I will see that before I go with the retirement. I think that will be a good farewell present for myself. But there's still a lot of work that needs to get done in order to get to that point. But we're definitely moving there, and we're moving at a pace that I've never seen before in this industry. So I'm really excited, right? Every year when I get to these type of conference or any other conference, there's something new that has come out, or a new technology or a new capability, or we've deciphered another very complex system within the human body. So I'm really looking forward to what the future will hold for us.
Well, Patrick,
Thanks a lot. That
Thank
was a
you.
fun conversation. And let's talk again a year from now at the same conference and see what happens.
Absolutely, I'm looking forward to that.
Perfect.